They said, "Fly out, Mom, we want you here for New Year dinner." They said it casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if those words didn't carry weight, as if they didn't reach deep into places I kept guarded. I didn't hesitate. When you are a mother, hesitation feels like mistrust. And mistrust, I was taught, had no place in the family. I remember standing in my kitchen after the call ended, phone still warm in my hand. The kettle had already begun to whistle. Steam fogged the small window above the sink, blurring the quiet street outside. Everything looked the same as it had that morning. The same chipped mug on the counter. The same folded dish towel. The same calendar with crossed-out days. But something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make the air feel thinner. They wanted me there. That's what mattered. I told myself not to overthink it. I had learned over the years that too much thinking could ruin a good moment before it ever arrived. Mothers are expected to accept invitations with gratitude, not questions. So I poured the tea. I sat down. And I let myself feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Included. I didn't live a big life anymore. That wasn't a complaint. It was simply the truth. My days had become quiet, measured in routines rather than milestones. I woke up early. I watered the plants even when it rained. I kept the radio low, mostly for the comfort of another voice in the room. The house still carried echoes. Not the loud kind, the soft ones, the kind that settle into walls and stay there long after people leave. I had learned to live alongside those echoes. The invitation felt like a door opening where I had grown used to walls. They talked about New Year dinner, about sitting together, about starting the year right. Their voices sounded warm, practiced maybe, but I didn't recognize that then. I heard what I wanted to hear. I heard belonging. I told them I would come. After we hung up, I stood by the window for a long time. The streetlights were already flickering on. Neighbors passed by, bundled in coats, moving toward lives that felt busy and full. I wondered if they could see me standing there, holding on to an invitation like it was something fragile. I packed lightly. I always did. A small suitcase, one good sweater, a scarf they'd given me years ago, back when gifts still felt thoughtful instead of obligatory. I folded everything carefully, smoothing wrinkles that didn't really matter. It was something to do with my hands while my mind wandered ahead. I told myself not to expect too much. But hope is not something you summon. It arrives on its own. The night before the flight, I couldn't sleep well. Not from excitement exactly. More from a restless awareness, like my body knew something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I lay awake listening to the house settle, to the soft creak of beams and the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about the last time we'd all been together. How conversations had felt shorter. How laughter had come easier when others were around. How silences had stretched longer than before. I told myself that was normal. Families change. Lives get busy. Still, I set my alarm early. At the airport, everything moved quickly. Too quickly. People rushed past with purpose, pulling bags, checking watches, scanning boards overhead. I followed the signs, the lines, the instructions. There is comfort in places where no one expects anything from you beyond compliance. I watched families sit together at the gate, children leaning against their parents, couples sharing headphones, people holding hands without thinking about it. I wondered when I had stopped being someone people waited with. The flight itself was uneventful. Clouds stretched endlessly below the window, soft and indifferent. I rested my hands in my lap and tried to imagine the dinner table. Who would sit where? What I would bring up? What I would avoid? Mothers learn to read rooms before entering them. It's a skill developed quietly over decades. I practiced smiles I might use. Gentle ones, not the kind that asks for reassurance. The kind that reassures others. When the plane landed, I felt that familiar disorientation, the sense that you've arrived somewhere but haven't quite caught up to yourself yet. I turned my phone back on as I walked through the terminal. No messages, that was fine, I told myself. They were probably busy, New Year preparations, traffic, timing never aligns perfectly. I waited near the exit. I watched people reunite. Hugs, laughter, names called out loudly over the noise. Each reunion felt like a small performance of belonging. Minutes passed. I checked my phone again. Still nothing. I told myself not to read into it. Waiting is something mothers become very good at. Waiting for children to come home. Waiting for calls. Waiting for moods to pass. waiting for moments that may or may not arrive. I waited. After a while, I stepped aside and called. No answer. I tried again. Voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I didn't want to sound impatient. I didn't want to sound like someone who expected something. I sat down on a bench near the wall, suitcase at my feet. The floor was cold through the soles of my shoes. People continued to stream past, each of them moving toward something certain. I told myself to give it time. Time passed. I checked my phone, then checked it again as if it might change simply because I hoped it would. Still no messages, no calls. The terminal felt louder now, or maybe I was quieter. I watched the arrival board update, names of cities flipping over, new flights listed. Everyone else seemed to be progressing forward. I felt strangely suspended, as if I had stepped off my own timeline. I called again. This time I left a short message. Neutral, calm, I've landed. Just let me know when you're close. I listened to my own voice as it recorded, surprised by how steady it sounded. Mothers learn early how to keep their voices even when their insides are shifting. I waited some more. Eventually, I stood and moved toward a quieter corner, away from the flow of people. I didn't want to be in the way. I never liked taking up space unnecessarily. That's when I overheard it, not intentionally, not because I was listening to it. The voices came from behind me, near a seating area separated by a low divider. Familiar voices. Voices I knew the rhythms of, the pauses, the way certain words were emphasized. At first, I didn't understand what I was hearing. Then I did. They weren't looking for me. They were talking about plans, about timing, about what would be easier if I wasn't there yet, about how things could be handled after. I didn't hear my name right away, but I heard enough to make something cold settle in my chest. I stayed very still. There are moments when the body reacts before the mind gives permission. My hands went numb. The sounds around me dulled, as if someone had turned the volume down on the world. All I could hear were fragments, phrases, half-sentences. They hadn't forgotten me. They had accounted for me. That realization is different, sharper. I understood then why there had been no message. No updates, no urgency. I wasn't late. It was inconvenient. I didn't confront them. I didn't step forward or call out. I didn't announce that I was there, listening, breathing the same air. I stayed where I was. Because sometimes, when the truth arrives, your first instinct is not to react, but to survive the moment with your dignity intact. I picked up my suitcase slowly. My hands were steady, even if my thoughts were not. I moved toward the exit without being seen. Or maybe I was seen, and it didn't matter. Outside, the air was colder than I expected. Night had settled in. Cars lined up at the curb, headlights bright against the dark. I stood there for a long moment, unsure of where to go next. Not physically, emotionally. I realized then how much of my identity had been tied to waiting. Waiting to be invited, waiting to be needed, waiting to be included. Standing there alone, I felt something unfamiliar begin to take shape beneath the hurt. Clarity. They had invited me, but they hadn't made space for me. There is a difference. I didn't cry, not there, not yet. I walked to the edge of the curb and signaled for a ride. When the car pulled up, I gave the address of a nearby hotel without thinking too much about it. The driver didn't ask questions. I was grateful for that. The ride was quiet. City lights passed by the window, reflections blurring into one another. I watched them without really seeing them. At the hotel, the lobby was warm and softly lit. The smell of coffee lingered in the air. A television murmured quietly in the corner. Life going on, indifferent to my small fracture. I checked in. Give my name, took the key. In the room, I set my suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed. The room felt impersonal, clean in a way that offered no comfort. I stared at my hands resting in my lap, noticing how ordinary they looked. Hands that had cooked meals, held fevers, wiped tears, signed permission slips, let go when it is time. I thought about the invitation again, about how easily it had been spoken, how effortlessly it had undone me. That night, I lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds, the hum of the heater, the distant noise of traffic. I replayed the conversation I'd overheard, not word for word, but feeling by feeling. I didn't wonder what I had done wrong. That stage had passed years ago. Instead, I wondered when love had turned into management, when a mother had become a variable to be handled instead of a person to be welcomed. I didn't call them. I didn't send a message. Silence, I had learned, could be a form of self-respect. As midnight approached, fireworks began to crackle somewhere in the distance. The new year arrived without ceremony. Without me at the table, it was meant to be celebrated around. I watched the ceiling and let the moments pass. Tomorrow, I told myself I would decide what came next. For now, it was enough to know one thing clearly. I had heard the truth. Morning arrived without ceremony. No knock on the door. No messages lighting up my phone. Just the soft gray light slipping through the hotel curtains, indifferent to whatever I had lost the night before. I lay still for a while, listening. The hallway outside carried the muffled sounds of other lives beginning their day, doors opening, footsteps passing, someone laughing too loudly for the hour. It reminded me that the world doesn't pause for personal reckoning. Eventually, I sat up. My body felt heavier than usual, not from exhaustion, but from awareness. The kind that settles after something has been understood and cannot be misunderstood again. I checked my phone. Nothing. No missed calls. No explanations. No concern. That silence told me more than any argument ever could. I showered slowly, letting the water run longer than necessary. The mirror reflected a face I knew well, lined, familiar, steady. I searched it for signs of collapse and found none. Hurt, yes, but also something else. Resolve. I dressed carefully, choosing the sweater I had packed with the thought that I might sit at a family table wearing it. The irony did not escape me, but I wore it anyway. I refused to let the meaning of my choices be rewritten. Downstairs, the hotel dining area was already busy. Families gathered around small tables. Someone clinked a spoon against a mug. A child whined softly, tired and impatient. Life, again, moving forward without asking permission. I poured myself coffee and sat alone near the window. For years, I had been taught, by circumstances, by silence, by expectations, that being alone meant being forgotten. That solitude was something to endure quietly, preferably without complaint. But that morning, sitting there, I realized something had shifted. I was alone, but I was not lost. I thought about the invitation again, about how neatly it had been delivered, about how confidently it had been spoken. "Fly out, Mom. We want you here." The words hadn't been untrue, they had just been incomplete. I paid for breakfast and returned to my room. I didn't rush. I had nowhere I needed to be, and for once, that felt like freedom instead of failure. Back upstairs, I opened my suitcase and began to repack. Folding the same clothes I had folded days earlier, but with different hands. Hands that now knew exactly where they stood. I paused when I reached the scarf. I held it for a moment, fingers tracing the familiar fabric. It had been given to me during a time when gifts still came without calculation, when affection didn't feel strategic. I folded it and placed it back in the case. Some things are allowed to keep their original meaning. I checked out before noon. At the front desk, the clerk smiled politely and wished me a happy new year. I thanked her and meant it, even if my voice caught just slightly at the edges. Outside, the air was crisp. The city looked no different than it had the night before. Cars passed. People hurried along sidewalks. No one noticed the quiet decision unfolding inside me. I didn't call them. I didn't need to. The absence of communication had already answered every question I might have asked. At the airport, I booked a return flight. The earliest available, not out of urgency, but out of clarity. I knew where I belonged, not because it was perfect, but because it was mine. While waiting at the gate, I thought about all the small moments that had led here. The overlooked calls, the shortened conversations, the way plans had increasingly been made without me, then presented as favors. I wondered how long I had been making myself smaller to remain convenient. The realization was uncomfortable, but it was honest. On the flight home, I didn't look out the window. I closed my eyes instead. Not to escape, but to organize my thoughts. I didn't plan speeches. I didn't rehearse confrontations. I wasn't interested in explanations that would never be fully sincere. What I needed now was not their understanding. It was my own. When I arrived home, the house greeted me the way it always had, quietly. The air inside felt still, familiar. I set my suitcase down by the door and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. It no longer felt empty. I made tea, the same mug, the same kettle, the same routine. But I was not the same woman who had answered the phone days earlier. I sat at the table and let the warmth seep into my hands. Outside, the sky was pale and calm. A new year had begun somewhere between departure gates and overheard conversations. I hadn't celebrated it with my family, but I entered it with clarity. Over the next few days, messages began to arrive. Short ones, casual ones. Carefully worded. "Where did you go? We thought you'd meet us. Things got busy." I read them without reacting. There was a time when those words would have sent me scrambling to explain myself, to smooth discomfort, to reassure. That time had passed. I didn't respond right away. I gave myself space, something I had rarely done without guilt. When I finally did reply, it was brief: "I'm home." I needed rest, nothing more, no accusations, no emotional explanations, just truth stated plainly. The response was delayed. Then came another message. Longer this time, more defensive, carefully constructed, misunderstandings. Timing issues, no bad intentions. I read it once. Then I set the phone down. Intentions don't erase outcomes, and explanations don't undo clarity. Days turned into weeks. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. I tended to my routines, took walks, organized drawers I had been meaning to sort through for years. There is something grounding about order, about reclaiming small spaces that belong only to you. I noticed something surprising during that time. I felt lighter, not because the hurt was gone. It wasn't. Some hurts don't disappear, they simply lose their power. What had lifted was the constant effort of accommodating, of adjusting myself to fit into expectations that were never fully mine. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old paperwork, I came across documents I hadn't reviewed in years. Titles, accounts, details that I had trusted others to manage on my behalf. I read them carefully this time. Every line, every clause. I didn't panic. I didn't assume betrayal where there was none. I simply made appointments, asked questions, took notes. Clarity is not dramatic, it is methodical. Over the following weeks, I reorganized my affairs quietly, updated information, clarified boundaries, made sure that what was mine remained clearly so. I didn't announce these changes. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. One evening, I received another call. I let it ring, not out of spite, out of choice. Later, a voicemail arrived. The tone was different now, softer, less confident. There was concern in it, or maybe inconvenience. It was hard to tell. I listened once, then I deleted it. Silence, I had learned, is not always absence. Sometimes it is alignment. I often thought about the word mother. How easily it is spoken. How heavy it can become when it is treated as a role rather than a relationship. I had been a mother my entire adult life. I had carried that identity proudly, even when it cost me more than I realized. But I was more than that. I was a woman with a life that existed beyond usefulness, and that mattered. One morning, while watering the plants by the window, I caught my reflection in the glass. The light fell gently across my face, highlighting lines I no longer tried to soften. I looked peaceful, not triumphant, not hardened, just settled. I realized then that the greatest shift hadn't been external. It had been internal permission. Permission to stop waiting. Permission to stop proving. Permission to stop explaining my worth. Family, I had learned, should not require self-erasure. Weeks later, I received an invitation. Another dinner, another gathering. This time, the wording was careful, respectful, vague. I read it without feeling pulled in any direction. And for the first time, I considered something new, not whether I was wanted, but whether I wanted to go. I declined politely. No drama, no justification, just a simple message. "I won't be able to make it. I wish you well." I sent it and set the phone aside. There was no guilt, only relief. That night, I cooked for myself. A modest meal, nothing elaborate. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of the small but significant boundary I had drawn. I thought back to the airport, to the moment I had overheard the truth, to how devastating it had felt. And I understood something then that I hadn't before. That moment hadn't broken me, it had released me. They had invited me for New Year dinner. But what they had really given me was the truth. And once you hear it, clearly, fully, you don't owe anyone your silence anymore. Not even family. You owe yourself honesty. And that, I had finally learned, was enough.